All right. Well, hello and welcome back to skate class. Things are going to be a little bit different now given the current situation, but with the power of the internet, we are going to do everything we can to provide you guys with some skateboard lessons, some tips, some tricks, some ways to stay active. And we're going to start out today with our first lesson plan talking about the history of skateboarding. So for today's first history lesson, we're going to be taking a look at the evolution of skateboarding. And we're going to be looking both at the equipment that people ride on, but we're also going to take a look at how the culture has evolved over time, because the two are very much connected. Without growing needs and demands for different equipment, arguably we would all still be riding things like this. So we're going to take a look at some of these boards throughout the decades and give you guys an idea for the different materials and the different ways people skateboarded. So to start things off, we're going to take a look at where skateboarding comes from. I know we've touched on this a little bit in class, and so if you don't remember, this is a refresher. This was it back in the day, top of the line. In the 1940s and 50s, if you wanted to skateboard, you were going to have to make it yourself. So all skateboards back in the day consisted of steel wheels. The trucks, if you can call them that, came off of roller skate assemblies, and everyone was making their own boards at home. Here's an example of a 50s style board that I made using an old water ski and old metal roller skate trucks. It is terrifying to ride. Thankfully, this is not what we are stuck with today. As things evolved and changed, in the 50s, skateboarding was a fad. It was viewed as sort of a hula hoop or a slinky. It was just a kid's toy. There was nothing else to it. But in the early 60s, things started to change heavily when surfers got a hold of skateboards. This was the sidewalk surfing revolution, and to coincide with that development, we had some upgrades in gear. So this is a Hobie Super Surfer from the 1960s. One of the big things that you'll notice is different is we have actual bushings in our trucks, and we have a huge upgrade, to clay wheels. Somehow, clay was viewed as a better alternative to metal. So all boards in the 1960s, including this lovely hot dog from Sears and Roebuck, came complete with clay wheels. Super fun until you hit a rock, at which point your wheel would most likely explode into dust. So we have 40s and 50s, 1960s surf style. One of the biggest changes to equipment in skateboarding was in the early 70s, the advent of the urethane wheel. As soon as people got their hands on wheels, riding styles exploded. And we're talking specifically here about Dogtown. So the Z-Boys in the 70s, as soon as they had access to these wheels, were able to start sneaking into backyards, riding pools, and this is where skateboarding as we know it really started to take shape. Moving away from the 70s, riders became obsessed with transition riding. They started building their own ramps. Vert became the dominant form of skateboarding in the 80s, and we had boards much like this Powell Peralta McGill. So very, very wide platform, lots of room for your feet. You'll notice we've gone from injection molded plastic to actual pressed wood, large kicktail, but in the 80s, street skating was not so much a thing yet, and so no one was really producing double kick boards. A lot of 80s boards had big tails and no nose to speak of, which brings us into the 90s and early 2000s when street skating really took over and became the dominant form. Producers of skateboards needed to adapt the equipment they were making, and so we have the introduction of the double kick skateboard. I believe Mike Vallely's Barnyard for World Industries was one of the first ever double kick skateboards that was very popularly accepted. This is what really transformed skateboarding into what we know it as today. So as the equipment evolved over time, it evolved in a response to the culture of skateboarding, the way that the public viewed it, the way that the skaters themselves felt about the sport. All of that drove the innovation in the equipment that we ride today. So in the 1940s and 50s, this skateboarding trend was really looked at as a toy, as a hobby. It didn't have any sort of lifestyle connotations. Extreme sports did not exist as a concept in the popular culture. And it was predominantly kids in the suburbs putting these things together, playing with them. Ironically, many of the first skateboards actually started out as scooters. If you Google milk crate skateboards, that's what a lot of the kids in the 1940s and 50s were building. They would take their deck, they would bolt on a wooden milk crate with handles, and they would scoot about town. As that started to evolve in the 1960s. The surf culture really took a hold of skateboarding, and they used it as an activity to do when the waves were flat. It was a way to build skills, practice balance, and continue to ride something even if they couldn't make it out there. So again, that's where someone started to take a look at, are steel wheels really the best option? They were updated to clay wheels, which in my mind still doesn't seem like an update, but it is what it is. The 1960s saw an explosion of popularity for skateboarding. The first skateboard mags were created. Skateboarding began to resemble a little bit more of what we know it as today. But it wasn't until the early 1970s when things really changed for skateboarding. At that time in the early 70s, there were contests. Brands did exist producing skateboards for kids to buy at the store, but most of the competition formats were things like slalom, riding through cones, freestyle, so spinning on your board, doing handstands, very, very different from what we see today. And one of the major turning points was the Z-Boys team down in Dogtown in Santa Monica went to a competition and completely changed what people thought was possible to do on a skateboard. As skateboarding continued to grow in the 60s, it hit its first death. Oh no! Where the culture was no longer supported by the mainstream. And around 1966, skateboarding had the rug pulled out from under it. Skateboard magazines stopped producing things. The popular eye turned away from skateboarding and, I don't know, went to disco. Whatever it was, skateboarding suffered its first major death in the 60s. It wasn't until the early 70s, with the advent of the urethane wheels and the world's introduction to the Z-Boys, that skateboarding really started to resemble what it is today. The Z-Boys, if you're unfamiliar with them, is a skate team from Dogtown down in Venice Beach, California, and they were finding all sorts of new ways to ride their boards. As soon as the urethane wheel was introduced, they realized that they could stick to walls and they could better replicate the surfing maneuvers that they love to do in the water. So we had the first generation of more punk rock outlaw skateboarders that would actively find empty swimming pools, break into backyards, and skate them. Lucky for us, this time period coincided with a major drought in California, which created an abundance of backyard pools for these people to go seek out and discover. Skate parks began being developed, which replicated the feeling that the Z-Boys were looking for when they were riding pools. We saw a huge growth of public skate parks being created as skateboarding again became fashionable, trendy, or popular in the public eye. The skateboard revolution that was created by the Dogtown riders was short-lived. No, it wasn't. It lasted until the 80s. The skateboard revolution that the Dogtown riders were creating had a major effect on skateboarding moving into the 80s. We talked about wider boards, we talked about vert. Skateboarders started to figure out how to build better ramps to accommodate the style of tricks that they were doing. Rather than using a complete pool-shaped bowl, they realized that putting a flat bottom in a ramp gave them more opportunities to pump, build speed, and actually transition into the air with greater ease. So the 80s saw a huge explosion with brands like Swatch, brands like Vision Streetwear that jumped onto this skateboarding cash cow, and they were putting on huge competition events. The other major cultural shift in the 80s is the advent and introduction of VHS tapes and VCRs. Up until this time, if you wanted to see skateboarding, you had to go find someone who could do it, or you could look at pictures. But the mid-80s and the Powell Peralta skate team changed all of that with the introduction of the Bones Brigade video series. Now people could see what is going into these tricks rather than seeing a still frame of a trick, and so many people were able to progress because they could watch what these people were doing on their boards and break it down and realize that it's achievable for them to do. So skateboarding hit a huge peak towards the end of the 80s, where it then suffered its second major death. Concerns about liability forced the closure of so many public skate parks, and skateboarding sort of recessed back into an underground sport that consisted mainly of backyard ramps that people were building and skating, because of course skaters are going to skate. After the second death in the 80s, we saw a huge innovation in skateboarding, and towards the end of the decade, we started to see the rise of street skateboarding. Street skateboarding made a huge impact because you didn't need a skate park, you didn't need a half pipe if you wanted to participate. All you needed was a skateboard and a sidewalk, a curb, a parking block, whatever you could find in your town became your skate park. In the early 90s, this is also where skateboarding became heavily stigmatized because there were hundreds of thousands of kids out in the world skating on people's property. This was the era of skateboarding is not a crime, where skateboarders had to argue that the thing they were doing had value and they had to fight to find a place in culture and society. That started to change at the end of the decade with things like the X Games, extreme sports as a more advertisable and pop culture friendly entity. We see skateboarding really coming out of that shell as a new thing and gaining tons of popularity, including skateboarding video games, more skateboarding videos, and competitions. As skateboarding continued to develop from the 90s into the 2000s, it began to be more acceptable. We saw a lot more competitions, public parks starting to get built, including the introduction of skateboarding nonprofits. Skateboarding had been around for a long enough time now that skateboarders knew how to pursue opportunities, including the building of public skate parks, more skate competitions and tournaments, a healthy skate shop scene that supported everyone's individual communities, and skateboarding was thriving. All of those changes over time bring us to today, and what skateboarding is, depending on who you ask, is a number of things. The biggest recent developments in skateboarding is that we are seeing skateboarding being included as an Olympic sport, which means threats and opportunities. One of the largest opportunities is skateboarding will be able to be competed in a global arena. So depending on who you ask, some people love it, some people hate it, but there is without a shadow of a doubt going to be a higher demand for skateboarding program and skateboard opportunities, which we at Alchemy see as an overall win. We believe that skateboarding's future really rests in the hands of skateboarders. So go out there, ride your board, define what you do however you want, and we'll see how skateboarding evolves in the next decade. All right, now that we've gotten to take a look at the history of skateboarding, both the gear and the culture, we have a little assignment for you guys. I want you to pick any decade that we just talked about, so 40s, 50s, 60s through today. Pick one decade, and I'd like you to do a little bit of research. I want you to find out more about what the top brands of that decade were, who the top skaters were, or who the best skate teams of the decade were. Some of this is going to be opinion-based, but I want you guys to do some digging, and I'd love to hear what you can learn about the history of skateboarding.